They called him the Collector. The desert still whispers when the wind hits bone. In 1877, the Arizona Trail wasn't just haunted by outlaws, it was cursed by one of the most terrifying figures to ever ride it, the Stagecoach Bandit who drank from his victims' skulls. Known as the Collector, Elias Boone didn't just kill for money, he killed for power, drinking the skulls of his victims in a twisted ritual to gain strength and immortality. What drove him to such gruesome extremes? And what became of him when his thirst couldn't be quenched? This is the disturbing story of Boone's descent into darkness, where the desert itself claimed him. Elias Boone had once believed in the simplicity of life on the frontier. He was no different than any other settler, just a man with a wife, a child, and a modest plot of land on the unforgiving Arizona Trail. For a time it seemed like his dreams of building a peaceful life in the wilderness were within reach, but that dream was shattered on a quiet, starlit evening, when the world he had fought so hard to create was taken from him in an instant. It was a day like any other when the bandits arrived. Boone had no warning, no time to prepare. The sky had barely begun to dim when the screams shattered the calm. His wife, Lily, and their infant daughter, Clara, were taken from him in a violent raid. They came in the dead of night, striking without mercy, leaving nothing but the wreckage of Boone's life behind. His home was burned to the ground. His family was gone. What followed was a darkness that even Boone's rough, desert-weathered soul could not have prepared for. He buried his wife and daughter in a shallow grave, their bodies cold in the earth beneath the same sky that had witnessed their lives. The man who had once been filled with hope and love was gone. In his place stood something far darker, a man who would stop at nothing to ensure no one else suffered the same fate. Boone spent weeks alone, aimlessly wandering the desert. His grief consumed him, and in his heart the thought of revenge began to stir. But revenge alone was not enough. There was a new hunger within him, something primal that clawed at his incessant need for something more, something beyond simple retribution. Then one day, Boone stumbled upon a traveling stagecoach, its wheels buried in the dust of the Arizona Trail. The stage had been ambushed, its passengers either dead or dying. Boone, driven by something he didn't understand, approached the wreckage. The bodies of the passengers were strewn about the road, lifeless, their pockets picked clean by the outlaws who had left them for dead. But Boone didn't think of the money. His eyes weren't drawn to the gold or the jewel, she was focused on something darker. As he gazed down at the bodies, a gruesome idea took root in his mind. In his shattered state, Boone could no longer see the people he killed as human. They were tools, objects, instruments to an end, to the kind of power that would allow him to escape. His grief and the ever-growing emptiness inside. Boone knelt down beside one of the dead, a man who had once been a traveler, a father, or a husband. But to Boone, this man was something else. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a strange rising compulsion. Boone gripped the man's skull and, without thinking, pulled it free from the lifeless body. The moment the skull was in his hands, a rush of heat surged through Boone's veins, a violent, all-consuming fire. His mind blurred. He raised the skull to his lips, his body moving on its own. He drank from it, the bitter taste of death hitting his tongue like an electric shock. His heart pounded, his vision swam. It wasn't just power he felt, it was control. It was as if the desert itself had whispered to him, telling him that this was the way forward. This was how he could survive. Boone stood there, gazing at the sun sinking beneath the horizon, feeling something awakening deep within him, something wild and terrifying. It was an addiction, a hunger that gnawed at his insides, a hunger he could no longer ignore. The act of drinking from the skull became Boone's ritual. With every new victim, his need grew. He didn't care who they were, where they came from, or what they had left behind. Boone became a hunter, stalking the trail for those he could kill, not for gold or treasure, but for the skulls. Each one was a prize, each one a link to the power he believed he was gaining, and every time he drank, the fire inside him burned hotter, deeper. He was no longer just a man. He was something far more dangerous, a creature born from pain and rage, bound to the unforgiving desert by the ritual of death. Weeks passed. Boone's reputation as a ruthless stagecoach bandit began to spread. His name was whispered in hushed tones in the towns he passed through the Collector. Few had seen him, but the stories were all the same. Those who crossed his path never returned. The desert had consumed them, leaving only the echoes of their screams. Boone's rise was unstoppable. His power was growing, fueled by the skulls he collected, one after the other. But the more Boone drank, the more the line between man and monster began to blur. He no longer cared about the victims' identities or their families. They were nothing to him. He needed the skulls. The thirst inside him became so consuming that he felt he couldn't live without it. He was driven by a madness that he couldn't escape, a madness that twisted his very soul into something unrecognizable. Boone's descent into darkness reached its breaking point one fateful day. As he stood over the body of his latest victim, a man whose face was still frozen in the agony of his final moments, Boone's eyes wandered to a familiar sight. It was another stagecoach, its wheels buried in the same dust that had claimed so many lives before. The difference this time was the smell. There was no blood, no struggle. It was eerily quiet. Boone approached the wreckage cautiously, his heart racing not with excitement, but with fear. What Boone found when he peered into the wreckage wasn't just another group of dead travelers. It was the source of his undoing. Inside the coach, still breathing but barely alive, was a woman, her clothes torn, her face bruised and battered, her eyes filled with terror. She looked up at him, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. Boone felt a strange jolt in his chest. It wasn't just the desire to kill that surged within him, now it was remorse. The woman's eyes reminded him of his own lost family, the family he had slaughtered in his mind again and again. He had killed so many, and yet now, standing over her, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. But Boone wasn't done. The desert had already claimed his soul. As the woman's last breath escaped her body, her eyes wide with shock, Boone realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even about power. It was about something else entirely. His descent had already been sealed the moment he drank from that first skull. Boone turned and walked away, leaving the woman behind, but not without a final, haunting thought echoing in his mind. There would be no redemption. He had become the very thing he had once feared, and now the desert itself had claimed him, body and soul. But Boone's hunger was far from satisfied. His obsession with the skulls was only beginning to twist him further, pushing him toward an unimaginable fate. The desert had made him a killer, but now it was turning him into something far worse. What Boone didn't know was that the land he had once called home had more in store for him than even his darkest nightmares could have prepared for. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Elias Boone rode alone, his mind a tangled mess of grief, rage, and an insatiable thirst for something beyond what any man should crave. He had killed before. Of course, he was no stranger to death. The desert was unforgiving, and survival often meant becoming someone you could barely recognize. But it was the first time he drank from a skull that everything changed. His first kill was never meant to be anything more than a robbery, a routine act of survival. But it was after the robbery, after the killing, that something inside him snapped. Boone stood over the lifeless body of a wealthy traveler as latest victim and stared down at the blood-soaked earth. The man's pockets were empty, but Boone wasn't looking for gold. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from an overwhelming, inexplicable compulsion. As the body lay there, its lifeblood spilled into the dirt, Boone found himself drawn to the skull, the one thing left untouched by the chaos. The skull was still warm, the remnants of the man's life clinging to it in a strange, grotesque way. Boone's fingers hovered above it as if guided by some unseen force. He had heard stories about rituals, about power being drawn from the dead, but Boone wasn't thinking of legends. All he knew was that this skull was calling to him. He didn't understand it, but it didn't matter. He reached down and with a sickening crunch tore the skull from the man's neck. It was a primal act, one that made his blood run cold and his mind race. But it wasn't just the horror of it that consumed him. No, it was something darker. A power surged through him, as if the very life of the man he had just slain was flowing into his veins. Boone didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to wonder if he was mad. He raised the skull to his lips and drank. The bitter taste of death flooded his mouth, but as it did, something more than just disgust churned inside him. It was like he could feel the power of the man, the life force he had stolen, fill him up. Boone's heart pounded in his chest as the world seemed to spin faster, more alive, more real than it ever had before. He could feel it, the power, the control. It was intoxicating. For a moment, Boone thought he might lose himself and Outlaws himself in the madness of what he had done, but he didn't. He stood tall, the taste of the skull still fresh on his tongue. The desert around him seemed quieter, as if it were waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't just kill to survive anymore. He didn't just take from the dead. He had tasted something greater, something that felt unholy, and now he couldn't stop. The man's life force, his soul, had passed into Boone, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a skull. And Boone, now more than just a man, was determined to fill that void with more. For the next few days, Boone became a ghost on the Arizona Trail, moving from one stagecoach wreckage to another, stalking his prey, hunting them not for what they carried, but for what he could take from them, their very essence, their skulls. He killed without hesitation, no longer burdened by the morality that once held him back. The world became a blur of death and blood, but the hunger inside him only grew, growing darker with every kill. Each skull he claimed was a step deeper into the abyss. But then came the twist Boone never expected, the twist that would twist his fate beyond recognition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Boone encountered a man unlike any other. The man was older, grizzled, with weathered skin and piercing blue eyes. He wasn't a traveler or a merchant or a soldier. He was something else, a man who had seen the darkest parts of the world and had survived. His name was Jedediah Brooks, a bounty hunter with a reputation that preceded him. Jedediah had been tracking Boone for weeks. He had heard the stories, the whispers in the wind. The Collector, they called him, an outlaw who didn't just kill for gold, but for something much darker. Jedediah was on a mission to stop this man from becoming a legend that the desert would never forget. Boone hadn't seen him coming. By the time he realized that Jedediah had him cornered, it was too late. The bounty hunter wasn't interested in gold. He was there to end Boone's reign of terror. Boone, his body trembling from the after effects of his latest ritual, reached for his gun, but Jedediah was faster. The two men stood there, locked in a tense standoff, the desert's heat pressing down on them like an iron vice. "You're the one they call the Collector," Jedediah said, his voice low but filled with disdain. "You think taking lives like this will give you power? You're nothing but a murderer, a monster, and you'll never outrun me." Boone, driven by the twisted power that had consumed him, felt the rage rise within him. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not after all the skulls he had drunk from, after all the power he had claimed. Jedediah wasn't just another bounty hunter to Boone. He was a challenge, a test. "You don't understand," Boone said, his voice hollow. "The skulls give me power. They make me stronger, faster. You can't stop me." The bounty hunter smiled darkly. "We'll see about that." The standoff ended in a blur of motion. Jedediah lunged, his gun firing. Boone reacted without thought, drawing his own weapon in an instant. The air was filled with a sound of gunfire, and when the smoke cleared, Boone stood, breathing heavily, with the body of Jedediah Brooks at his feet. It had been too easy, but there was something unsettling about the kill, something that didn't feel right. Boone hadn't even hesitated. The man's body was still warm as he knelt down, preparing to take what he always took, the skull. But when he tried to reach for it, something strange happened. The moment his fingers brushed against the skull, a violent jolt of pain shot through his chest. He recoiled, stumbling back. It wasn't like anything he had felt before. The power that he had always believed came from the skulls now felt wrong. It was as if the very act of taking this man's life had triggered something within him, something dark and twisted that Boone wasn't prepared for. For the first time, Boone felt fear. Not for the desert or the bounty hunters, but for himself. What had he become? As the pain in his chest began to subside, Boone stood up, looking down at the man he had just killed. He had taken countless skulls before, but never had the act felt so empty. Was this power worth it? Was it worth losing everything for? Boone's world was no longer as clear as it had been when he first set out on his path of vengeance. The desert had given him power, yes, but it had also begun to take something from him, something he wasn't sure he could get back. Boone's thirst for the skulls had brought him power, but now it was beginning to take more than he could give. With Jedediah's death still haunting him, Boone realizes that he may be crossing a line that cannot be undone. But what he doesn't know is that the desert has far darker plans for him, and the worst is yet to come. Boone had learned quickly that there was no room for weakness on the Arizona Trail. The desert didn't care about who you were or what you had lost. It simply took and took, until nothing was left. And the more Boone drank from the skulls of his victims, the more the desert seemed to take from him. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn away from the power, the strength that surged through his veins every time he consumed the dead. The thirst grew insatiable. As the days passed, Boone's reputation spread like wildfire. The Stagecoach Bandit Who Drank from the skulls of his victims was no longer just a name, it was a legend. Townsfolk spoke of him in hushed voices, of the Collector who could disappear into the dust and never be seen again. He didn't leave behind riches or body just skulls, remnants of lives taken for no reason other than the hunger that consumed him. His kills were becoming routine. No longer did Boone hunt for treasure, he hunted for death itself, searching for anyone who might cross his path. It didn't matter who they were or what they had. All he saw was the skull, waiting to be claimed, waiting to feed his twisted hunger. One afternoon, Boone came upon a small caravan, its wagons parked in a shallow valley surrounded by scrubby bushes and dry creek beds. It wasn't the usual target. There was no stagecoach, no merchant's cart laden with gold. The people in the caravan looked like they were simply passing through, ordinary folk with no idea of the nightmare they were about to encounter. Boone approached quietly, his boots silent on the parched earth. He didn't need to rush. The caravan wasn't fleeing, wasn't armed. These were simple travelers, perhaps a family, perhaps traders. It didn't matter. As Boone drew near, the wind shifted, and he caught the faint scent of cooking fire and sweat. There were three of them, an older man, gray-haired and tired, a woman who looked to be his daughter, and a boy, no older than 16, with wide eyes and a nervous expression. They were seated around the campfire, talking in low tones, unaware of the danger creeping toward them. Boone's heart raced not with excitement, but with something darker, something deeper. His hands trembled. The hunger, the insatiable need to feed on their skulls, gnawed at him. He approached with practiced stealth, but just as he was within striking distance, the boy looked up. Their eyes locked. For a brief, terrible moment, Boone froze. The boy's face was young, innocent. He wasn't a bandit, or a soldier, or even a traveler with a hard past. He was just a boy, a child full of fear and confusion. And for the first time in a long while, Boone felt a flicker of doubt, a spark of humanity that threatened to crack the stone shell he had built around himself. But the boy didn't scream. Instead, he stood, his hand gripping a small knife, his eyes wide with terror, but also a strange sense of defiance. In that instant, Boone realized that this wasn't just another victim. This boy, this child wasn't a part of the world Boone had come to know. And for a brief second, Boone considered turning away, but it wasn't enough. His need to feed was too strong. Before he could think, Boone moved. The boy's knife slashed the air, a desperate, futile gesture against the force of Boone's strike. Boone grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off his feet. The boy struggled, gasping for air, but Boone's grip was ironclad. The woman screamed as the older man reached for a rifle. Boone twisted the boy's head violently, snapping his neck in a single brutal motion. He dropped the lifeless body to the ground, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer just about survival. This was about something far darker, something that had taken root in him. The woman's shriek echoed in the valley as she rushed to her son's side. Boone watched her, numb to the pain he had caused. It was as if he were outside his own body, detached from the horror he had just wrought. He could barely hear her screams, could barely register the old man sobbing. All that mattered was the skull. He dropped to his knees beside the boy's body, ignoring the woman's cries, ignoring the older man's shaking fists. He didn't even look up as he pulled the boy's skull from his head, his fingers trembling with greed. The boy's face, once so full of life, was now just a hollow mask, waiting to be consumed. Boone raised the skull to his lips and drank. The moment the bitter taste hit his tongue, something inside him shifted. The power was there, yes, but so was something else, or something worse. Boone felt the boy's presence inside him, the sudden weight of his soul filling his chest. The force of it was staggering. His stomach churned, his vision swam. It wasn't the power of the desert or the power of the dead that filled him now, it was something far more terrible. It's not just power, Boone realized with horror, it's them. But it was too late. The boy's soul, the last shred of humanity Boone had buried deep inside him, was now an indelible part of him. The desert had claimed him completely. The woman and the older man had stopped screaming. They were watching him, their eyes filled with terror and disbelief, but Boone could no longer see them. All he could see was the next skull, the next victim. Boone stood, his body shaking. The woman's face was a blur through his growing madness, but he could hear her sobbing. It was her fault, he thought. She had been weak. She had shown him the boy, shown him the flicker of what he used to be, and now it had cost them everything. The old man was already on his feet, a rifle in hand, but it was too late. Boone was already moving, already closing the distance between them. The rifle fired, but Boone was too fast. He knocked the weapon aside and, in a blur of motion, struck the old man down, snapping his neck with ease. The woman ran, but Boone didn't chase her. She was too far gone. He didn't care about her now. She was just another broken piece of his past. The hunger wasn't satisfied, not yet. There would always be more skulls, more power. But as he turned away from the campfire, a flicker of something, a flash of humanity tugged at him, but it was quickly smothered by the hunger that consumed him. He stumbled forward, his mind racing with the horrors of what he had done, but the thirst was always there, waiting. Boone left the caravan behind, its charred remains soon to be covered by the desert winds. The land, once something he had sought to conquer, was now his master. Boone's descent into madness had begun, but with the boy's soul now a part of him, the consequences of his hunger were only just beginning. What he didn't know was that the land itself was closing in on him, and no amount of power could save him from what he had become. Boone had never imagined the desert would become his prison. It was supposed to be his kingdom, the place where he would reign unchallenged, feeding his hunger for power with every victim he claimed. But as the days wore on, the land around him began to change. The sun seemed harsher, the nights colder, and the very air felt thick with the weight of something watching him, waiting for him to slip further into the darkness. The skulls were no longer enough. Boone could feel the creeping unease in his chest, a gnawing emptiness that grew deeper with every passing day. He drank from them. Yeshi took their power, their lifeblood with each one. Something inside him fractured, something that went beyond his humanity. The faces of his victims began to haunt him. The boy's face, the older man's, even the blank soulless stare of the woman he had killed, they all floated in the back of his mind like ghosts, whispering, accusing, calling him a monster. It was one late afternoon, as the shadows stretched long across the sand, that Boone met someone who would change everything. He had been traveling for days, the landscape becoming more desolate and barren, when he came across a small campfire. This time it wasn't a caravan or a lone traveler. It was a figure-an old man, cloaked in tattered rags, sitting cross-legged near the fire, his eyes fixed on Boone as though he had been expecting him. Boone didn't think much of it at first. After all, he had become used to strangers. It was easy to make them disappear. But there was something about this man, something unsettling in the way he stared at Boone, something that made Boone pause before he drew his gun. "You've been taking them," the old man said, his voice rough, yet strangely calm. Boone's hand tightened on the grip of his revolver. "What do you mean?" "The skulls," the old man continued. "You've been taking them to feed your hunger, but you haven't stopped to think about what you've become, have you?" Boone was taken aback. He hadn't heard anyone speak like this before, especially not someone who didn't seem to be afraid of him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and edged with warning. The old man chuckled softly, the sound gravelly. "Oh, I think you do. The power you've been drinking from those skulls sits not what you think it is. It's not power, it's a curse, and it's been passed down for generations. You think you're stronger. You think you've conquered death. All you've done is made yourself a vessel for something far darker, something that's been waiting in the desert." Boone's mind raced, confusion mixing with growing anger. "You're lying," he spat. "I control it. I control it all." The old man shook his head slowly. "No, you don't. You think you're in charge, but the desert tit knows what you've done. It's been waiting for someone like you, and now it's coming for you." Boone's grip on the revolver loosened slightly. The words struck him harder than he cared to admit. He had always known something was wrong, something was off, but he had refused to acknowledge it. The whispers in his head, the visions of his victims, they were growing louder, more real. Boone had thought it was just madness creeping in, but what if the old man was right? What if the desert, the very land he had tried to claim, had some kind of hold on him? "You think the skulls give you power," the old man continued, his voice growing softer, more sinister. "But they're not just skulls, Boone. They're vessels, vessels for the spirits of the dead. And every time you drink from one, you invite them inside. You think they're giving you strength, but what if they're taking it from you? What if you're nothing but a puppet, dancing on strings pulled by something ancient?" Boone's mind raced as the old man's words sank in. A puppet? Could it be? Had he truly become nothing more than a vessel for the dead? His thirst for power had driven him to consume the skulls, but now he wasn't sure if he was feeding off them or if they were feeding off him. The old man's eyes glinted with knowing, as if he had been watching Boone for far longer than Boone could comprehend. "You think you're the one doing the taking, don't you? But the desert has been taking you for years, feeding off your suffering, your rage. You're nothing more than a sacrifice to the land." Boone felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Was this just the ramblings of an old man, a fool lost to madness? Or was there truth in what he said? He didn't know anymore. But one thing was clear, the desert wasn't finished with him. In a flash of fury, Boone lunged toward the old man, his revolver raised. But before he could pull the trigger, the old man vanished into the air, his body dissolving into a cloud of sand and dust, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his voice. "The desert is coming for you, Boone. the voice whispered, as if carried on the wind, "and there's no escape." Boone staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. His vision swam, and for a moment, he felt the weight of something far greater than himself pressing down on him. The power he had once embraced now felt like a trap, a prison built by his own hands. The winds howled around him, and the sky seemed to darken. Boone stood alone in the desolate wasteland, feeling the weight of his actions, the weight of every life he had taken. But the thirst was still there, gnawing at his insides, but something else had entered his. Blood, something darker, something ancient. The desert was closing in, and Boone, no longer sure of his own mind, could feel its grip tightening around him. Boone had thought he was in control. He had thought the skulls gave him power. But now, with the desert's curse haunting him, he realized he was merely a pawn in a far older game. What Boone didn't know was that the land itself was claiming him, and the worst was yet to come. The sun was setting over the Arizona Trail as Boone rode through the desolate land, his heart pounding in his chest. The desert had always felt like home, unforgiving, harsh, a place where only the strong survived. But lately, the land felt different, as if it was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The hunger was never far. It had grown over time, a gnawing, insatiable need that Boone couldn't escape. He thought he had conquered it, thought he could control it. But now, every time he drank from a skull, it felt like the power was slipping through his fingers, like he was becoming something else entirely. He had grown stronger, yes, that was undeniable. The more skulls he claimed, the more invincible he became. He could feel the desert's power coursing through him. He could run faster, strike harder, kill without hesitation. His senses were sharper, his body more attuned to the land. It was as if the desert itself had become a part of him, feeding him with its dark energy. But with each victory, with each skull he drank from, something else grew inside him, a dark, creeping madness that seemed to swallow him whole. His victims no longer mattered. Their faces blurred together, each one another step toward the abyss. He had killed dozens of people, men, women, even children, but their deaths no longer affected him. All that mattered was the skull, the power it gave him, and the never-ending thirst that consumed him. Boone had become a living nightmare, a figure of death that haunted the Arizona Trail, his name whispered in terror wherever he went. But now, something was different. The closer Boone got to his next kill, the more uneasy he felt. He'd been tracking a lone stagecoach for days, following its trail through the desert, knowing that it would soon pass through a narrow pass that would make it an easy target. He could already taste the power that would come with the skulls of the coach's passengers. But there was something nagging at him, a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. As the stagecoach appeared on the horizon, Boone dismounted, his heart racing with anticipation. He hid behind a large boulder, waiting for the moment to strike. His hand trembled as he gripped his revolver, ready to end the lives of whoever dared to pass through this cursed land. But before he could make his move, something caught his eye. At the front of the coach, there was a figure, a man, standing tall, his back straight, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't the typical traveler Boone was used to. The man wasn't cowering, in fear, or looking for a way to escape. Instead, he was looking straight ahead, unbothered, as if he knew exactly what was coming. Boone froze. He'd been hunting this coach for days, and yet, this stranger seemed different. There was something about him, something that Boone couldn't quite place. The man's eyes met Boone's, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The desert air was still, the world holding its breath. "You've been looking for me," the man said, his voice low and steady, as if he were speaking to an old friend. "I can feel your hunger." Boone's breath caught in his throat. How did he know? How could he possibly know what Boone had been doing? This wasn't just another traveler. This wasn't just another victim. The stranger stepped forward, slowly, his movements deliberate. Boone raised his revolver, pointing it at the man, but the stranger didn't flinch. "You think you've mastered the power of the skulls," he said, his voice like gravel, "but you haven't. You've only become its servant." The words hit Boone like a blow to the chest. His grip on the revolver tightened, but his hand shook. He didn't understand. This man was supposed to be his next victim. He was supposed to take the skull, drink its power, and grow stronger. But this madness thing was challenging everything Boone had believed. "You've been feeding the land with your bloodlust," the man continued, "but now the land has fed you back. You think you can walk away from it, but you can't. The desert owns you. The skulls. You drink from there, not just power. They're a curse, and the more you take, the more you become like them." Boone's mind was reeling. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to be in control. He had made himself stronger than anyone else on the trail. The desert was his kingdom. He had conquered it. But as the stranger spoke, Boone felt something inside him shatter, a crack in his soul that he couldn't ignore. The thirst was still there, gnawing at him, but now it felt different. The skulls didn't give him power anymore. They were taking something from him, something he couldn't get back. The stranger smiled darkly, as if reading Boone's mind. You've been taking their souls, but what you don't understand is that the desert is taking yours, and now you are nothing but a hollow vessel, a puppet for something far older than you. The words hit Boone like a wave. The world spun, and his vision blurred. He had heard rumors, of Corseth's stories of the desert's dark power, of the spirits that haunted the land, but he had never believed them. Not until now. The skulls weren't just a way to gain power, they were a gateway to something far darker, something that had been waiting for him. Boone staggered backward, his hands trembling. The stranger was still watching him, his eyes full of pity. You've taken everything, the stranger said, his voice soft but filled with disgust. Now the desert will take everything from you. In a flash, the man vanished into the dust, leaving Boone standing, alone in the silence of the desert. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He was no longer sure of anything. His thirst, his hunger, had led him to this moment, and now the land had claimed him. But as Boone stood there, staring into the emptiness, he felt something stir deep within him, something powerful, something alive. It was as if the desert itself had wrapped its fingers around his soul, pulling him closer to something ancient, something malevolent. He had become part of it, and there was no escape. Boone's realization that he has become the desert's puppet is only the beginning. The land has claimed him, and now its curse will shape the rest of his fate. But what Boone doesn't know is that the desert's grip is only tightening, and something far darker is waiting to take control. Boone had never felt so hollow. His stomach churned, and the world around him seemed to close in with every step. The air in the desert felt thicker now, as if it was alive, pressing against him, pulling him into its unforgiving embrace. He had never questioned the hunger before. The skulls had been his means of survival, his way of gaining power, of controlling the forces around him. But now he could feel the land itself tightening around his chest, its grip unrelenting. He had been traveling for days, unable to stop, unable to think clearly. The visions had grown more vivid, those faces, those whispers. The victims' voices haunted him day and night, their eyes following him through. The desert, accusing him of the darkness he had become. It had been different at first, he told himself. It had been about survival, about gaining strength. But now, it was as if the desert had taken something more from him than just his humanity. It had taken his very soul. But still, Boone couldn't stop. The thirst was too great, the need too overwhelming. He had killed so many, drank from so many skulls, and with each one, the power surged through him. It felt like the land itself had become part of him, a part he couldn't escape. The skulls had stopped giving him power, but he had learned to embrace the darkness they provided, the emptiness inside him that grew with every soul he consumed. And yet, somewhere deep within, there was a flicker of doubt. It was subtle, like a whisper in the back of his mind. But it was there. The desert had given him strength, but it had also taken something. And Boone didn't know how much more he could give before there was nothing left. It was on the fourth day of his journey that he stumbled across her. He had been walking aimlessly, his mind clouded with the weight of his actions, when he saw her, a young woman, sitting by the edge of a dry creek bed, her clothes torn and dirt-streaked, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Boone didn't know why she didn't run, why she didn't scream. She simply stared at him, as though she had seen the darkness that lay inside him. She didn't look like a traveler. She didn't look like someone who belonged in this world of death and despair. There was a strange sadness in her eyes, but there was also something else, defiance, a strength that Boone hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. She was the first survivor. Boone's hand instinctively reached for his revolver, but he hesitated. The girl didn't move. She didn't run. Instead, she looked at him with a strange calmness, as if she had been expecting him. "You don't have to kill me," she said, her voice soft but steady. Boone froze. "What did you say?" The woman stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I know who you are. I know what you've done." Boone took a step back, his pulse quickening. He had killed so many, left no survivors. How could this woman know what he had done? How could anyone know? He had been careful. He had left no trace, no evidence of his actions. Yet this woman stood before him, as if she could see through him, as if she knew everything. "I've heard the stories," she continued, her voice shaking slightly now. "The collector. They say you drink from the skulls of your victims, that you take their souls. But what they don't know is that you're not just taking life from them, you're taking it from yourself too. You've been feeding the land with your death. But the land isn't kind. It takes, and it never gives back." Boone's mind raced. How could she know these things? Who was she? What was she? "Why don't you just kill me then?" she asked, her voice low. "Why don't you end it now? You've done it before." For the first time, Boone hesitated. The thirst was still there, but it felt distant, muffled by the strange weight of her words. She wasn't afraid of him, not in the way others had been. She wasn't pleading for her life or begging for mercy. She was waiting for him to do something, waiting for him to make the choice. Boone's grip on the revolver tightened, then loosened. His hand trembled, but not from fear. He didn't know what it was. He couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. "I can see it in your eyes," the woman said, her voice breaking through the fog in his mind. "You've lost yourself, but it's not too late. You don't have to keep feeding the desert. You don't have to keep drinking from the skulls. You can still leave." Boone felt a strange rush of confusion. He was trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own choices. Every part of him screamed to end a tender, end his torment, but another part of him, something buried deep inside, began to question her words. "I know what you've become," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "But you can stop. You're not too far gone. The desert can't claim you if you stop feeding it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Boone looked at the woman not as a victim, not as someone to be killed, but as something else, something human. She was offering him something he hadn't felt in so long, hope. But Boone was too far gone. The hunger surged, overwhelming him. His hand jerked, his revolver rising once again. But then the ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew cold. The woman's eyes widened in horror as the desert began to shift around them, a low rumbling noise filling the air, like the sound of something ancient awakening. "You cannot escape us." The voice was everywhere, seeping into his ears, into his very soul. It was the desert, the land he had fed, the land he had claimed that it was speaking to him. Boone stumbled back, his mind swirling. He could hear the whispers of his victims, the faces of the dead flooding his thoughts. And then the desert's curse became clear. It wasn't the skulls that had given him power. It was the land itself, feeding off him, claiming his soul with every life he took. The woman turned and ran, but Boone didn't chase her. Instead, he sank to his knees, the weight of the desert's curse crashing down on him. The land had claimed him, and there was no turning back. Boone's moment of hesitation had sealed his fate. The desert's grip was tightening, and now, it wasn't just the land feeding on him, it was the very spirits of the dead he had consumed. There was no escaping the curse, and as the desert closed in, Boone realized that the worst was yet to come. Boone didn't know how much longer he could keep going. The whispers in his head had grown louder, more insistent. The skulls, the power, the desert it was all tangled up now, a twisted web of madness and hunger that he could untangle. Every time he killed, every time he drank from another skull, it felt like a piece of him was slipping away, consumed by the very thing he had once controlled. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close to something far darker. Days had turned into weeks as Boone roamed the desert, following the endless trail of death he had left behind. His once keen senses now felt dull, his body weighed down by exhaustion. The hunger was always there, gnawing at him, but it was different now. Every time he thought about it, he could feel the desert's presence, its grip tightening around his soul. He'd become something else. The Collector was no longer just a name. It was his very essence, the thing that defined him. He was more than an outlaw now. He was a monster, a force of nature, a creature born of death and the land itself. But it wasn't enough. The more skulls he claimed, the more power he felt coursing through him. It wasn't enough to be strong anymore. He needed more. He needed to be something unstoppable. That was when the first real challenge came. It started with the fire. Boone had been camped out in a hollow, the wind whistling through the rocks as he sat hunched over a fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on his worn face. The world around him was silent, too silent. The desert had never been quiet, not like this. Had become used to the endless howls of the wind, the crackling of fire, the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. But tonight, it felt as if the world was holding its breath. It was then that he saw them. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, a shadow moving quickly through the desert, too fast to be natural. Then another and another, until a group of figures emerged from the darkness. They were wearing tattered cloaks, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. But there was something in the way they moved, something wrong. Their movements were too fluid, too precise, like they were being pulled by some invisible force. Boone didn't have time to think. He reached for his revolver, but before he could draw, the figures were upon him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. It was as if the land itself had sent them, as if the desert had finally decided to come for him. Boone fired first. The bullet flew through the air, but the cloaked figure it was aimed at didn't flinch. Instead, the figure simply raised its hand, and the bullet stopped midair, falling harmlessly to the ground. Boone's heart skipped a beat. The figures were too close now. One of them lunged at him, and he barely managed to dodge, his heart racing. The other figures surrounded him, their movements so swift and deliberate that he couldn't keep up. Boone fired again, but this time the shots went wide, missing their mark entirely. For the first time in what felt like forever, Boone felt fear. He had become so used to being the predator, so used to controlling the land, that he had forgotten there was something greater than him, something that was watching him, waiting for him to fall. And then, the leader of the group stepped forward. Boone froze. The figure was taller than the others, its cloak more elaborate, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. But Boone could feel its eyes cold, piercing, full of something ancient. The leader raised a hand, and the other figures stepped back, leaving Boone standing alone before them. "You've been feeding on the land, Boone," the leader said, its voice a low, eerie whisper that seemed to echo through the stillness of the desert. "But the land has a price, and you've reached it." Boone's hand trembled as he gripped his revolver. "Who the hell are you?" "We are the desert," the figure replied, its voice echoing in his mind. "We are the ones who have been waiting for you, watching you as you consumed what was never yours to take. You've fed on the souls of the dead, but you've never considered what it costs." Boone's mind raced. The desert? Was this some kind of madness? Had his hunger driven him so far that he was seeing things? But as the leader of the figures stepped forward, Boone could feel the heat rising from the ground, a strange energy that pulsed beneath his feet. The desert was alive, and it was coming for him. The leader raised its hand again, and the ground beneath Boone cracked, a deep fissure opening in the earth. The desert had begun to consume him. "You have become part of it now," the leader said, its voice softer, almost sad. "The land has claimed you, and there's no escape. The skulls you have taken, they are the ones who have led you here. You are nothing but a puppet, dancing on strings pulled by forces far older than you." Boone's heart pounded. The hunger inside him was overwhelming, but now he could feel it, the pull of the land, the weight of the curse, the voices of the dead, calling to him from the depths of the earth. And in that moment, Boone realized what the leader had been telling him. The desert had not made him stronger, it had made him weaker. Each skull he drank from, each soul he claimed, had only brought him closer to this point, a point where the desert would swallow him whole. The figures closed in, but Boone didn't fight them. He couldn't. The desert had already won. Boone's final moment of realization came too late. The desert had taken everything from him, and now there was no escape. But what he didn't know was that the desert's curse wasn't finished with him. It was only just beginning. The desert had him now. It wasn't just the hunger that gnawed at his insides, nor the thirst that made his hands tremble whenever he looked at a skull. It was the land itself, the unforgiving terrain that had given him power, that had allowed him to consume the souls of the dead, that now sought to claim him entirely. Boone didn't remember how long he had been wandering after the figures had left him. Time had become irrelevant. All he knew was that the land was no longer his to command. It had turned on him, just as the old man had warned. Every step he took felt like it was dragging him deeper into a prison he could not escape. The whispers grew louder, the visions more intense. The spirits of the dead were no longer distant memory, as they were right there with him, pressing against his mind, demanding something from him. The hunger was unbearable now. Boone had long stopped thinking of it as just a need. It had become his purpose, the thing that kept him alive. But now, with the desert's curse binding him, it felt different. It felt like a chain, dragging him deeper into the earth. Every skull he had claimed, every life he had taken, was not giving him power. It was feeding the land, feeding the darkness that sought to consume him. He had made his way to an old ruin, a crumbling structure made of stone that had once been part of a long-forgotten settlement. The wind howled through the broken walls, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Boone had come here to find answers, to seek something that might free him from the curse, but the ruin only served to remind him of the emptiness that had consumed his soul. And then he saw Ida's symbol carved into the stone wall, its lines jagged and sharp, like the claws of some ancient beast. It was a symbol Boone recognized from the old stories of rituals, of power drawn from the land itself, the same kind of rituals that had consumed him. A voice echoed in his mind, one he hadn't heard before, yet somehow knew intimately. "You've taken more than you could handle, Boone. Now you will pay the price." Boone's heart raced. He had heard the whispers of the desert before, but this was different. This voice wasn't a spirit, it was something else, something ancient. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Without thinking, he approached the symbol, his hand trembling as he traced the jagged lines with his fingers. The moment he touched the stone, the ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew cold. The voices rose in a cacophony, each one calling to him, pleading with him to stop. But Boone couldn't stop. The thirst, the hunger, it was too strong. The stone beneath his fingers cracked, a deep rumble shaking the earth. Boone stumbled back, fear gripping his chest. He knew what he had to do, what he had been drawn here to do, but the cost of it was unimaginable. His eyes darted to the skulls he had collected over the years. They were piled in the corner of the ruin, their empty eye sockets staring at him like silent witnesses to his crimes. Boone's mind raced. This ritual, this final act was what he had been seeking all along. It wasn't just power. It was something deeper, something that would tie him to the land forever. He had wanted to become something more than human, but he hadn't realized that in doing so, he would be bound to the very forces that had made him a monster. And now, as the ritual began to take shape before him, Boone knew that there was no turning back. His hand hovered over the pile of skulls, but as he reached out to touch them, the ground shook violently, throwing him to the floor. The voices in his mind grew louder, more frantic. "Stop," they whispered. But their words were drowned out by the roar of the wind, the sound of the desert's fury. Boone's body was shaking, his soul torn between the desire to complete the ritual and the realization that doing so would condemn him to an eternity of suffering. Then, something unexpected happened. The skulls moved. They shifted and twisted, as if alive, their empty eye sockets glowing with an eerie light. The air around Boone grew thick with a dark energy, the very earth beneath him pulsating with the power he had awakened. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the land itself had claimed him, pulling him deeper into the earth. And then, before he could fully comprehend what was happening, the skulls began to speak. They were never yours to take, they said in unison, their voices cold and hollow, like the wind passing through empty halls. "You have fed us, and now you must pay the price." Boone's eyes widened in terror. The power he had sought was not what he had expected. He had believed that the skulls gave him strength, that they made him invincible. But now he realized the truth. He had been nothing but a vessel, a pawn in a game that had been played long before he had ever stepped foot in the desert. The ground beneath him cracked open, and from the fissures rose a dark, swirling energy. It was the desert itself, angry, hungry, and now fully awakened. The spirits of the dead, the very force Boone had sought to control, rose. From the earth, their faces twisted in agony, their voices shrieking in pain. "You are ours now," they said, their words a chorus of fury. "You are part of the desert, part of the curse that binds us all." Boone tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. He was trapped by the very power he had sought to control. The desert had claimed him, and now he was nothing more than a puppet, bound to its will. The last thing Boone saw before the darkness consumed him was the face of the first victim he had killed, the boy, his empty eyes staring back at him. Boone felt the weight of all his actions, the lives he had taken, the power he had sought, and now there was nothing left but the desert's wrath. Boone's final moment of realization had come too late. The desert had consumed him, and there was no escape. But the land's wrath was far from finished. As the curse of the collector claimed him, the desert began to stir, preparing for what was to come next. The desert was alive with fury. It raged in the winds, it howled through the cracks in the earth, and it surged through the very air around Boone. He had been consumed, trapped in a world he could no longer control. The desert had taken him, and now he was nothing but a puppet, a vessel for the ancient curse that had claimed him. Boone could feel the weight of the land pressing in on him, its power swelling around him like a storm that would never end. The Skullstow's empty, lifeless vessel had become a part of him, their voices echoing in his mind, their hunger filling the cracks of his soul. The desert had claimed him, and now he was its servant, a prisoner bound to its will. But there was one thing Boone hadn't expected, something darker than even the desert itself. It started as a whisper in the wind, soft at first, like a distant cry. But as the storm in the desert grew stronger, so did the whisper. The voices became clearer, more distinct. It was as if the spirits of the dead, the ones Boone had consumed, were now speaking directly to him. "You thought you could take from us," a voice hissed, one he recognized, a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like forever. It was the boy's first soul he had ever consumed. Boone staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The desert was changing around him. The sky darkened, and the very ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. The boy's voice echoed in his mind, louder now, joined by the others, the voices of the victims he had killed, the ones he had fed to the desert. "You belong to us," the boy's voice whispered again, full of anger and pain. "You were never meant to walk free, and now you will pay the price." The wind began to pick up, swirling around him, carrying with it the voices of the dead, their cries mixing with the sounds of the earth itself. The desert had given him power, yes, but it had always demanded a price, and now it was collecting. Boone tried to move, tried to fight against the overwhelming weight of the desert's power, but it was futile. The air around him thickened, and the ground cracked open, as if the land itself was tearing apart to swallow him whole. The skulls he had collected as trophies rose from the earth, glowing with an eerie light, their empty eyes fixed on him. He had tried to escape, tried to control it, but it was too late. The desert had already claimed him, body and soul. Every skull he had taken had only fed the curse, and now he was paying the ultimate price. The voices of the dead grew louder, merging into one deafening roar. "You are ours." Boone fell to his knees, unable to bear the weight of the voices, of the power that surrounded him. His body trembled, his skin burning as if the desert itself were consuming him from the inside. He was no longer human. He was no longer alive. He was part of the desert, bound to it forever. And then, in that final moment of despair, something changed. The desert's grip loosened, just for a moment. A flicker of light appeared, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the darkness. It was the first sign of hope Boone had felt in years, but it was fleeting. The land had claimed him, but it hadn't finished with him yet. The skulls, the spirits, the desert, they were not just punishing him. They were preparing him for something else, something worse. Boone screamed as the darkness closed in around him, his cries swallowed by the wind, his soul forever bound to the desert he had sought to conquer. Boone had become a part of the desert's curse, but the land's hunger was far from satisfied. The curse that had claimed him would not rest until it had devoured everything. The end of his story was only the beginning of something far darker. Boone had become one with the desert. His mind was fractured, lost in the endless void of whispers and spirits that surrounded him. He had paid the price for his actions, his soul bound to the land that had claimed him. But even in the suffocating darkness, there was still something stirring, something deeper than the land itself. The desert had taken him, yes, but it had not forgotten the others, the ones who had once crossed his path, those who had fallen under his hand. Their souls were still out there, waiting to reclaim what he had stolen. And Boone, no matter how far he had fallen, could still hear their voices in the distance, calling to him. The ground beneath him trembled again, a low rumble that felt like a heartbeat. Boone's eyes opened, but there was nothing to see. He was no longer in the world he had once known. There was only the desert, its barren landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. For a brief, fleeting moment, Boone thought he could escape. Maybe, just maybe, he could break free of the curse that had bound him. Maybe there was a way out. But then, the earth split open. It wasn't a crack in the ground, it was a tear. The very fabric of the land seemed to split open, revealing a vast chasm beneath him, filled with blackness that stretched down farther than his mind could comprehend. It was as though the desert itself was trying to swallow him whole. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, and the whispers grew louder. He couldn't breathe. The weight of the land, of the curse, pressed down on him like a vice. He could see the figures now the spirits of the dead that had once been his victims, now rising from the chasm, their forms twisting and writhing in the air. They were no longer just whispers in his mind. They were real, live, and they were coming for him. Boone tried to scream, but no sound came. He could only watch in horror as the spirits, their faces twisted in agony, surrounded him, their hollow eyes locked onto his, and he felt their pain, their anger, their hunger. They had been his victims, but now they were his tormentors. "You can't escape us," one of the spirits whispered. Its voice was cold, like the wind over broken bones. "You are ours now, forever." Boone tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't respond. The spirits closed in, their hands reaching for him, their fingers icy cold as they brushed against his skin. He could feel the weight of their anger, their pain, all of it crashing down on him. They had been nothing more than vessels to him, tools to feed his hunger. But now they were taking back what he had stolen. And then, in the deepest, darkest part of his soul, Boone understood. The desert had never given him power. It had only given him the illusion of control. The skulls had not made him strong. They had made him weak, a pawn in a game played by forces far beyond his understanding. He had thought he could dominate the land, but now The land was consuming him. It had always been the land's game. Boone's body began to tremble violently. He felt the desert's fury coursing through him, the earth itself rising up to claim him. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't his heartbeat anymore. It was the desert's, the land's, the spirits. And then, with a final deafening roar, the desert swallowed him. When it was over, the desert was quiet once again. Final payoff, there would be no more skulls, no more victims, no more collector. But the desert had not forgotten, and as the wind swept across the barren wasteland, it whispered Boone's name. The curse had been passed, and there would be others who would walk the Arizona Trail, others who would feed the land, others who would pay the price for the desert's insatiable hunger. Boone's legacy, his dark reign of terror, would live on in the whispers, in the land itself. For the desert, like death, was eternal, and once you became part of it, you could never escape.